This is the first pathway through which sugar drives hypertension. The second involves the effect of chronically high insulin on your nervous system. Sustained insulin elevation activates the sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system, the same system that responds to stress and danger. That activation increases your heart rate, raises the force of cardiac contractions right now. At this very moment, your circulatory system is under pressure. Not figuratively, literally. Every artery running through your brain, wrapping around your kidneys, feeding your heart. Each one is being pushed against from the inside with every single beat. That pressure is constant. It doesn't pause when you sleep, doesn't ease when you relax, and it doesn't announce itself with pain or warning signs until something has already gone seriously wrong. That's what makes it so dangerous. And that's what makes it so misunderstood. We've spent the better part of 5 decades being told that the path to healthier blood pressure runs through the salt shaker. Reduce your sodium. The message goes, and your arteries will thank you. Public health campaigns have been built around it. Dietary guidelines have centered on it. And yet, despite decades of low-sodium advice, hypertension remains one of the most widespread and undertreated conditions in the modern world. Millions of people follow the guidance faithfully, cut their salt, watch their intake, and still see no meaningful change in their readings. Something isn't adding up. And what's becoming increasingly clear through more recent research is that there's another player involved, one that operates through a completely different biological pathway, one that has nothing to do with how much water your body holds and everything to do with how your hormones are telling your organs to behave. That player is sugar, and it has been quietly driving blood pressure up through a mechanism most people have never been told about. To understand why any of this matters, you first need to understand what blood pressure actually is at a mechanical level. It isn't one single thing. It's the result of 3 distinct forces working simultaneously inside your cardiovascular system. The first is how much blood your heart pumps out with each contraction, the volume it pushes into circulation every minute. The second is how much total fluid is moving through that closed system at any given time. The third is how tight or relaxed your arteries are, whether they're open and flexible, allowing blood to move through easily, or narrow and stiff, forcing your heart to push harder just to keep things moving. Raise any one of those 3 factors and your pressure climbs. Raise all 3 at the same time, and you have a genuine crisis building in slow motion. Each of those factors is controlled by a different part of your body's regulatory system. Your heart rate and the force of each contraction are governed by your autonomic nervous system, particularly by the signals from adrenaline. The total amount of fluid in circulation is managed primarily by your kidneys, which decide continuously how much sodium and water to keep and how much to send out as urine. And the tension in your artery walls is controlled by the thin layer of cells lining every vessel in your body. These cells produce a molecule called nitric oxide, which acts like a natural relaxant for your arterial walls. When nitric oxide is flowing, your vessels stay supple and blood moves through them easily. When nitric oxide production falls, walls stiffen, resistance builds, and pressure rises, even if your heart rate hasn't changed and your fluid volume hasn't shifted at all. What this picture reveals is that blood pressure isn't a single dial you can turn with a single adjustment. It's the downstream result of multiple systems interacting: kidneys signaling, arterial flexibility, hormonal balance, and nerve activity all converging at once. That complexity is exactly why one-size-fits-all advice about eating less salt works beautifully for some people and does almost nothing for others. The question that actually needs answering isn't just what you're eating. It's which part of your pressure system is under strain and why. Salt does have a real and well-documented effect on blood pressure, but it works in a specific and somewhat mechanical way. Sodium is what scientists call osmotically active, which means that wherever sodium goes in the body, water is obliged to follow. When you eat a salty meal, sodium enters your bloodstream, and your body, which keeps very tight control over sodium concentration, pulls water in from surrounding tissues to dilute it. That expands your circulating blood volume, and more volume in a closed system means higher pressure. It's not complicated. It's essentially the same principle as overfilling a water balloon. Your kidneys respond to that rise by activating a hormonal cascade designed to bring things back down. They begin excreting more sodium in the urine, which draws excess water out with it, and over the course of several hours the pressure normalizes. In a person whose kidneys and vessels are working properly, this correction happens quietly and efficiently. They eat a salty dinner, their pressure ticks up briefly, and by morning everything is settled back to baseline without any lasting harm. But not everyone's system corrects so cleanly. Some people, particularly those with reduced kidney function, those with certain inherited tendencies, or those whose blood vessels have lost some of their natural flexibility, are what researchers call salt-sensitive. Their kidneys don't clear the sodium as quickly, and the pressure elevation lingers longer. For these individuals, reducing sodium genuinely helps. For everyone else, particularly the large portion of the population whose blood pressure problems stem from something other than volume, cutting salt alone is unlikely to make much difference at all. And that distinction between a volume problem and a hormonal problem is at the heart of why so much blood pressure advice has fallen short. Sugar enters this picture through an entirely different door, and it starts with insulin. When you eat refined carbohydrates or foods high in added sugar, your blood glucose rises and your pancreas releases insulin to bring it back down. Most people understand that part of the story. What most people don't realize is that insulin doesn't just move glucose into cells. It also sends a direct signal to the kidneys to hold onto sodium. Not because you've eaten any more salt, but because insulin itself is a sodium-retaining hormone. The more insulin your body releases, the more sodium your kidneys absorb, and the more water follows that sodium into your bloodstream. Your blood volume expands, your pressure rises, and none of it has anything to do with your salt intake, and constricts peripheral blood vessels. The result is higher output from the heart and more resistance in the vessels simultaneously. Both of those push pressure up. The third pathway involves fructose specifically, which is one half of ordinary table sugar and the dominant sweetener in processed food. Unlike glucose, fructose is metabolized almost entirely in the liver, and one of the byproducts of that metabolism is uric acid. Elevated uric acid has been shown consistently in research to impair the ability of the cells lining your arteries to produce nitric oxide. When nitric oxide falls, vessels lose their natural elasticity and can no longer relax properly in response to pressure changes. Uric acid also increases sodium reabsorption in the kidneys directly, independent of insulin, creating yet another route through which fructose-rich diets lock pressure higher. So sugar is simultaneously expanding blood volume through insulin-driven sodium retention, raising cardiac output and vascular resistance through sympathetic nervous system activation, and damaging the arterial lining through uric acid. It is operating on all three pillars of blood pressure at once. And it's doing all of this whether your salt intake is high or low. Where things get particularly troubling is in the context of insulin resistance, which has become extraordinarily common across much of the world. In a metabolically healthy person, insulin rises after a meal, does its job of clearing glucose from the bloodstream, signals the kidneys to temporarily retain a little sodium, and then falls back to low levels within a couple of hours. The kidneys then release that sodium, and the pressure returns to baseline. The system cycles cleanly through its correction. But in someone with insulin resistance, where cells have stopped responding efficiently to insulin, that fall never fully arrives. The pancreas keeps pumping out more insulin, trying to compensate for reduced cellular response. And as a result, insulin levels stay elevated not just for a few hours after meals, but throughout the entire day. The kidneys never receive a clear signal to release the sodium they've been holding. They're locked in retention mode around the clock, regardless of how little salt the person is eating. The hormonal override is permanent as long as the underlying metabolic dysfunction continues. And on top of that, chronically elevated insulin progressively damages the endothelial lining of the arteries. Nitric oxide production falls. Vessels stiffen. Now you have a system where blood volume is being artificially inflated through constant sodium retention, and simultaneously the vessels carrying that blood are becoming less able to accommodate it. Both arms of the pressure equation are being pushed in the wrong direction at the same time, and reducing sodium intake doesn't touch either mechanism. That is the metabolic pressure trap, and it is why so many people have spent years faithfully following salt reduction advice and seen almost nothing change. Modern processed foods make this worse by delivering both problems simultaneously. A single serving of many packaged cereals, ready meals, or fast food items contains high sodium and high refined carbohydrates together. That combination is not coincidental. It is the result of deliberate formulation designed to maximize how appealing and consumable the product feels. The sodium creates an immediate pressure rise through volume expansion. The refined carbohydrates spike insulin, which prevents your kidneys from ever releasing that sodium. The pressure goes up quickly and stays up persistently because the hormonal correction mechanism has been chemically blocked. And there is another layer to this. Whole, minimally processed foods are naturally rich in potassium, the mineral that counterbalances sodium in the body. Potassium helps the kidneys excrete sodium efficiently and supports relaxation in the arterial walls. Processed foods, by contrast, are typically low in potassium and high in both sodium and refined carbohydrates. The combination of high sodium, low potassium, elevated insulin, and uric acid-driven vascular damage creates a perfect and sustained environment for rising pressure. It also explains why hypertension tracks so closely with industrial food systems rather than with traditional diets, even those traditionally high in salt. When you understand the full picture of what drives blood pressure upward, you can immediately see what's needed to bring it back down. Physical activity is one of the most effective tools we have, and its power comes from what it does to the arterial lining directly. Sustained movement creates a kind of physical force against the walls of blood vessels, and that force stimulates the endothelial cells to produce more nitric oxide. Vessels become more relaxed, more responsive, and more capable of absorbing changes in pressure without pushing back. That effect extends for hours after exercise ends, which is why regular movement creates lasting improvement rather than just a temporary shift. Dietary fiber works through the insulin pathway. By slowing how quickly glucose enters the bloodstream after meals, fiber flattens the spikes in blood sugar that drive insulin release. Lower insulin means the kidneys are no longer being signaled to retain sodium around the clock. They begin responding to actual sodium intake again rather than to a constant hormonal command to hold on regardless. Natural regulation resumes. Sleep, often overlooked entirely in blood pressure conversations, acts through the autonomic nervous system. When sleep is consistently poor or insufficient, the sympathetic system stays activated at a higher baseline, keeping heart rate elevated and vessels partially constricted even during rest. Deep, restorative sleep allows the parasympathetic side to take over, slowing the heart, widening the vessels, and allowing pressure to settle naturally. Everything the body does to regulate pressure works better when the nervous system gets genuine rest. What connects all of these interventions is that they work through actual biological mechanisms. They restore the conditions your cardiovascular system needs to regulate itself properly. Insulin drops and stays low, allowing kidneys to handle sodium normally. Nitric oxide rises, allowing vessels to remain relaxed and compliant. The sympathetic nervous system settles, taking cardiac output down from its chronically elevated state. These aren't surface-level changes. They are the recalibration of a hormonal and vascular environment that has been pulled out of balance. Medications for hypertension are effective and they genuinely save lives. But it's worth understanding what they do and what they don't do. A drug that dilates blood vessels reduces resistance, but doesn't address why vessels were constricted. A drug that forces the kidneys to excrete more sodium reduces volume, but doesn't address why kidneys were retaining it in the first place. The underlying metabolic dysfunction continues, and the medication manages the downstream consequences without touching the root cause. That's not a failure of medication. It's simply the limit of what medication can do on its own. What becomes clear, both in clinical settings and in the research, is that the people who see the most sustained improvement in blood pressure are those who address the metabolic foundation alongside any treatment they're receiving. When visceral fat decreases, when whole food replaces processed food, when movement becomes regular, the body starts regulating itself better at every level. The kidneys respond to sodium appropriately again. The arteries become more flexible. The signals that were locking the system into a high-pressure state begin to quiet down. Medications, where they're needed, work better against a system that's already beginning to heal. The original question, salt or sugar, turns out to have a more nuanced answer than either side of the debate tends to acknowledge. Salt and sugar are not equivalent, but they are not opposing. They act through different mechanisms, and in modern diets, they almost always arrive together. Salt creates a temporary and mechanical pressure rise through fluid dynamics. Sugar creates a chronic and hormonal pressure elevation by disrupting the very systems the body uses to correct fluid imbalances. Salt is a volume problem. Sugar is a control problem. And processed food is where both problems converge, delivering sodium to raise pressure acutely and refined carbohydrates to prevent the body from ever bringing it back down again. Hypertension is not, at its core, a disease of too much seasoning. It is a disease of a food environment that systematically overwhelms every layer of the body's pressure regulation at once. Addressing it means understanding all of those layers and restoring the biological conditions in which they were always meant to function.